Chris Wells was watching his life come apart. His wife was divorcing him. She'd moved in with his sister, his own sister, and her husband. But court documents say Chris Wells had a solution. Kill them. Kill them all. But his sister Tammy Rafferty wasn't home that night. The night prosecutors say Chris Wells' hitman showed up and killed Chris's wife and Tammy's husband. Investigators saw right through Chris Wells' solution. Arrested, convicted, locked up. And according to the sole survivor, still planning to finish the job.
9 News crime and justice reporter Anastasia Bolton has spent months tracking this case and the flow of money that has some convinced there's another hit coming.
Tammy Rafferty carries a gun and knows how to use it. You might too if you knew that your life is worth $5,000. According to court documents, that's how much her brother was willing to pay someone to have her killed. $5,000 is approximately the amount of money Chris Wells has in his prison bank account now. That money is coming from a man investigators questioned about the original murders. Now you know why Tammy Rafferty is scared.
Bob. You just say his name and you have to smile. Very honorable and very loving. Cared so deeply about family. He loved just the right way. An amazing father and a great husband.
24 years of marriage ended in the early morning hours of February 23rd, 2011.
That was the most wicked crime scene that I've ever seen.
Tammy Rafferty's husband, Bob Rafferty, was found dead in his home.
As Bob drew his last breaths, I'm certain that he was grateful that the kids and I weren't home.
Prosecutor Chris Gallo.
You could see just different instances of carnage throughout this otherwise beautiful house.
I wish it would have been me there instead of him.
Tammy's sister-in-law, Amra Wells, was dead as well. Her 6-year-old daughter, a witness, ran and called for help. The two had been living with the Raffertys for 6 months, while Amra was going through an ugly divorce from Tammy's brother, Chris Wells.
Chris and Amra had a difficult relationship, and Amra Wells decided that she wanted to leave Chris, and that did not go over well with him.
Sergeant Jason Weaver was the lead detective in the murder case.
She was so afraid for her life and the life of her child. They even came up with a game plan of how to get out of the house in case of a situation occurred similar to this. She was afraid.
The immediate suspect, estranged husband Chris Wells. At the time of the murders, Wells was in jail for violating a protection order.
But I want to know who did this, and I think you can help me. I don't have any idea. Why would I have any idea?
Through the interviews with all the suspects in the case, we were able to show that Chris Wells had promised Josiah Scher $10,000 to kill Amra Wells, and then another $5,000 for every other family member in that house.
Scher was the trigger man. 2 others helped. All pleaded guilty. All are in prison. Chris Wells pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. He's serving 2 consecutive life sentences without parole. But in February of 2011, during that first interview, Wells told investigators he didn't have any money for anything like this.
Did you pay anybody to hurt your family? I don't have any money, sir.
But the man police interviewed 3 times during the murder investigation told them Wells had given him $75,000 about 7 months before the murders. This man, Wells calls his best friend.
These are names that have come up in my investigation. Okay. A guy named Garth Wilson. He's my best friend. He's your best friend? Yes.
Garth Wilson told investigators he worked with Wells. And $75,000 wasn't a loan, it was still Chris's money.
I'm going to tell you July, because
of 2010?
10.
Okay.
He gave me $75,109 and change.
What was the conversation prior to him giving you the $75,000?
He told me it was so Amra couldn't get it.
Wilson told investigators he lost some of that money in the stock market, but had about $40,000 left.
I'd like to give it to his daughter. I want to build back up.
Back to the $75,000.
$75,000, and I'd like to either go into her name or into a trust in her name.
This is Garth Wilson with Amra Wells. We wanted to ask him where the money he wanted to give to her daughter went, but his attorney declined an interview. Wilson was never named a suspect or a person of interest in this case. He is giving Chris Wells money in prison, according to the Department of Corrections. $300 a month, every month. As of the end of July, Wells has over $3,500 in his DOC bank account.
I don't feel safe. He's close to having the $5,000 that he had on my head. He's close to having that now. He's in contact, I'm sure, with people that are going to be paroled. He's a master manipulator, so he will use all means to control, whether it's blackmail, whether it's being able to pay them off. That's what he does.
I think anybody who crosses that threshold of putting a price to a human life, hiring another person to extinguish a family, I think somebody's always going to be capable of that evil.
Inmates are allowed to have money. There are no savings or deposit limits. They cannot write a check, but can get a money order.
It's absurd that somebody who can be tied to using large sums of money to wreak havoc on a family can then have large sums of money at their disposal.
I give an analogy of allowing a pedophile time alone with a child. It doesn't add up, it doesn't make any sense. So those are laws I feel very, very adamant that need to be changed.
The Colorado Department of Corrections sat down with us for a very open, candid interview about inmate banking. They did tell us that 9 News Asking Questions brought up an issue they're considering changing, but they do not plan to limit inmate bank accounts. And Chris Wells, well, he wrote us a letter. That and the DOC interview tomorrow night. Anastasia Bolton, 9 News.
This is Chris Wells, Colorado inmate 157305. His steadily growing prison bank account has almost $5,000. What would a prisoner do with that kind of money? Well, prosecutors say the last time Chris Wells had $5,000, he tried to use it to hire a hitman to kill his sister Tammy.
I think there'll always be a bounty on my head until he's dead, until Chris is dead.
Chris Wells is in for life, but his sister tells 9 News crime and justice reporter Anastasia Bolton she isn't worried about Chris getting out. She's worried about his money getting out into the hands of somebody who might finish the job. So we asked the Department of Corrections how it plans to stop a murder before it happens.
I sometimes feel like this has happened to somebody else's family.
There is just so much pain and loss one heart can take.
Bob. You just say his name and you have to smile.
Tammy's husband, Bob, was murdered in their home 2 years ago. She misses him.
Every day.
And every day, she tries to fill her heart with love.
I'm a very positive person.
Investigators say Tammy's brother, Chris, hired people to kill his wife, Amara, and Bob. According to court documents, he promised $10,000 for Amara's death and $5,000 each for Bob and Tammy. Tammy was out of town on business.
You know, you just kind of feel like, how could this have ever happened to us?
Chris Wells pleaded guilty and has been in prison for over a year now, serving 2 consecutive life terms. Despite Chris being in prison, Tammy still fears for her life.
I don't feel safe, especially when I was able to find out that he's receiving money.
Since being in prison, Wells has been receiving $300 a month. Department of Corrections records show a man by the name of Garth Wilson is making those deposits. Investigators interviewed Wilson 3 times while looking into the murders. He was never named a suspect. Wells called Wilson his best friend. Wilson told police Wells was a business associate who gave him $75,000 7 months before the murders.
He went hammer to find it.
Wilson, through his lawyer, declined to tell us why he's putting money into the prison account of a convicted murderer. As of the end of July, Wells has more than $3,500 in his DOC bank account. An average inmate has $51.
He's close to having the $5,000 that he had on my head. He's close to having that now.
Chris Wells needs 3 things in order to murder again.
Prosecutor Brett Cochran was on the team of people who put Wells away for life.
He needs financial resources. He needs to find somebody that is willing to carry out these horrific acts. And he's in the Department of Corrections, where there's a lot of hardened criminals, a lot of violent people who are getting paroled every day. I think he's going to be able to find somebody that's willing to do this for money. He needs a motive. And so the question is, does he have a motive? Well, he had a motive to kill his sister, Tammy Rafferty, and he acted on it, and he failed. I believe he still has that motive.
I understand their concern.
Roger Werholz is the outgoing interim executive director of the DOC.
I think it would be very difficult for him to use that bank balance that is in his DOC account to harm them.
DOC says inmates need to be able to save because most eventually get out and need the money. Inmates cannot write a check. They can ask for a money order with approval.
There are ways to manage those transactions to limit the possibility of misuse.
DOC says it does not want to limit the amount of money inmates can save up.
It's difficult for us to write policy for everybody except people who have a conviction where the circumstances of the case are murder for hire.
Werholz says 9 News asking questions raised a different red flag within the agency, a possibility of a change in how fast restitution is paid back to the victims. Every month, Wells pays 20% of the $300 deposited towards restitution. That's $60. He owes $34,000. At $60 per month, he'll be paying that for a long time.
We'll take a look at whether there is a more appropriate use for that money, such as restitution. And again, not just in the particular offender's case, and make sure that they have repaid their victims and try to restore some of the damage that they've done. It can never be repaired for the Rafferty family, obviously. What we can do is try and assure them that we're going to manage any expenditures out of those accounts as best we can.
There is only so much pain a heart can take, and Tammy's has reached its limit.
My husband and sister-in-law were murdered when he was in jail. That's the reality we live with. People who are doing time for murder for hire cannot have access to large amounts of money. No one is safe in that scenario.
We contacted Chris Wells asking him if he intended to hurt any member of his family. Also, why he needed so much money in prison and why Garth Wilson was making those monthly deposits. Chris Wells wrote us a letter. In it, he says, part, quote, "It's a shame the family has not moved on from this. I took a plea deal, not because of guilt, but to spare my daughter years of agonizing trials and media scrutiny," end quote. He went on to write, quote, "Tammy Rafferty is not afraid for her life. She's attempting to seek revenge for the death of her husband," end quote. In his 1.5-page letter, Chris Wells writes a lot of things, but he does not answer any of our questions. Anastasia Bolton, 9 News.